The first thing I noticed when I pulled my truck through the heavy snow up to my grandfather's old hunting cabin in the Adirondacks was the bright orange foreclosure notice stapled to the door where my family name had hung for 63 years. I sat there with the engine idling, staring at that piece of paper like it might disappear if I looked hard enough. My grandfather built this place in 1962 with his own hands, cutting every log from the surrounding forest, and my father had passed it down to me 5 years ago when he died. I came up here every winter from my home in Albany to hunt, fish, and get away from the noise of the city. The cabin sat on 12 acres of pristine woodland in Essex County, far enough from civilization that you could actually see the stars at night. I climbed out of the truck, my boots crunching in the February snow, and ripped the notice off the door. The paper was official looking, stamped with some seal I did not recognize. According to the document, the Pinewood Ridge Homeowners Association had seized my property for unpaid fees totaling $8,300, plus interest and penalties. The cabin and land were scheduled for auction in 2 weeks. The problem was, I had never heard of Pinewood Ridge Homeowners Association in my entire life. My cabin had existed decades before any development came to this area. There were no covenants, no restrictions, no HOA when my grandfather built it. Just wilderness and freedom. I unlocked the door and went inside, finding everything exactly as I had left it in November. My hunting gear hung on the wall, canned goods lined the shelves, and the wood stove sat cold and waiting. I called my lawyer, Marcus Thompson, right there from the cabin. Cell service was spotty, but I managed to get through. "Marcus, I need you to look into something for me. Someone is trying to take my cabin." "Slow down, Jake. What are you talking about?" I read him the notice word for word. I could hear him typing on his computer as I spoke. "Jake, give me until tomorrow. I will dig into this and call you back. In the meantime, do not sign anything or acknowledge any debt." I spent that night in the cabin, stoking the wood stove and trying to make sense of the situation. The next morning, Marcus called back with news that made my blood boil. "All right, I found out what happened. About 3 years ago, a developer bought up a bunch of land around your property and built a luxury housing community called Pinewood Ridge. They incorporated as an HOA and somehow managed to get your property included in their boundaries on the county maps. How is that even legal? It is not necessarily, but they filed the paperwork and no one challenged it. The HOA board then started sending bills to your address in Albany for monthly fees. When you did not pay, they claimed you were delinquent and initiated foreclosure proceedings. I never got any bills, Marcus. I believe you. My guess is they sent them knowing you would not respond, then used that as justification to seize the property. It is a land grab, Jake. These HOAs sometimes target properties that look abandoned or seasonally occupied. What can we do? We fight it. I will file an emergency motion to halt the auction and contest the foreclosure. But Jake, you need to get me every piece of documentation you have proving ownership and the history of that property. Deeds, tax records, everything. I drove back to Albany that afternoon and spent the next 3 days assembling 40 years of paperwork. My grandfather's original deed, my father's inheritance documents, every tax payment receipt I could find. I had paid property taxes to Essex County faithfully every year. There was never any mention of HOA fees because there was no HOA when my family settled there. Marcus filed the motion, and we got a court date set for 3 weeks out. In the meantime, the HOA was not backing down. I started receiving certified letters at my Albany address, each one more threatening than the last. They claimed I owed additional fees for unauthorized structures and violation of community standards. One letter actually cited me for not having approved paint colors on my cabin, even though the logs were bare wood and had been for 6 decades. The woman signing all these letters was named Patricia Winters, president of the Pinewood Ridge HOA board. I looked her up online and found exactly what I expected. A middle-aged woman with an overly styled blonde bob, too much makeup in her Facebook photos, and a history of complaints about everything from barking dogs to mailbox heights. She had moved to Pinewood Ridge 2 years ago from Connecticut, and apparently decided that her mission in life was to make everyone conform to her vision of suburban perfection. 2 weeks before the court date, I drove back up to the cabin to check on things. What I found made me want to put my fist through a wall. Someone had changed the locks. There were new signs posted on my property declaring it Pinewood Ridge HOA Common Area No Trespassing. My grandfather's name plaque was gone from the door. I called the Essex County Sheriff's Department. Deputy Rodriguez arrived 40 minutes later, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who had probably seen every kind of property dispute imaginable. "Sir, according to the records I am pulling up, this property is currently listed under Pinewood Ridge HOA management due to foreclosure proceedings. That foreclosure is being contested in court. This is my legal property. I have the deed." "You have it with you?" I did. I kept a certified copy in my truck now, along with the most recent tax payment receipt. She examined both documents carefully. "Sir, this is a civil matter between you and the HOA. I cannot force entry to the property without a court order. You will need to resolve this through your lawyer. So they can just steal my cabin and you will not do anything. I understand your frustration, but my hands are tied. If you have proof of ownership, bring it to court. That is the proper venue." She drove away, leaving me standing in the snow staring at my own property that I could not access. I took photos of everything, the new locks, the signs, all of it. Then I called Marcus. They changed the locks and posted no trespassing signs. This is beyond a legal dispute now. They are occupying my property. Document everything and send me the photos. This actually helps our case. They are acting like they own the property before the court has ruled. Judge Patterson is not going to like that. The next 2 weeks dragged by like months. I could barely sleep, thinking about my grandfather's cabin in the hands of these people who had no right to it. Finally, the court date arrived. I met Marcus at the Essex County Courthouse in Elizabethtown, a stately old building that had been dispensing justice in the Adirondacks since the 1800s. Patricia Winters was there with her lawyer, a slick-looking guy in an expensive suit named Brandon Chase. Patricia looked exactly like her photos, with that aggressive suburban mom haircut and a permanent expression of disapproval. She glanced at me like I was something unpleasant she had found on the bottom of her shoe. Judge Patterson was a gray-haired man in his 60s, with the weathered look of someone who had lived in the mountains his whole life. He reviewed the case file with careful attention before calling the proceedings to order. "This is the matter of Jake Morrison versus Pinewood Ridge Homeowners Association regarding property foreclosure. Counselor Chase, you represent the HOA?" "Yes, Your Honor. The facts are straightforward. Mr. Morrison's property is located within the boundaries of Pinewood Ridge and is therefore subject to our HOA regulations and fees. He has failed to pay mandatory assessments for 3 years, accumulating debt of over $8,000. We followed proper foreclosure procedures as outlined in New York state law." Judge Patterson turned to Marcus. "Mr. Thompson, Your Honor, the Morrison family has owned this property since 1962, decades before Pinewood Ridge existed. There was never any HOA agreement signed, no covenant entered into, no consent given to join this association. The HOA unilaterally included my client's property in their boundaries without his knowledge or permission, then billed him for fees he never agreed to pay. This is not a legitimate foreclosure. It is theft. Strong words, counselor, Judge Patterson said. Appropriate words, Your Honor. I have here the original deed from 1962 showing clear ownership. Tax records proving my client has paid county property taxes consistently for 40 years. And documentation showing the Pinewood Ridge development did not even break ground until 2022. They cannot retroactively force someone into an HOA. Brandon Chase stood up. Your Honor, when Pinewood Ridge Incorporated, we worked with the county to establish our boundaries based on geographical features and property lines. Mr. Morrison's parcel fell within those boundaries. New York state law allows HOAs to enforce regulations on all properties within their jurisdiction. Did Mr. Morrison sign any HOA agreement? Judge Patterson asked. The previous landowner, his father, was sent notification of the boundary establishment in 2022. My father died in 2020, I said loudly. Marcus put a hand on my arm. Your Honor, may my client address the court? Judge Patterson nodded. I stood up, trying to keep my voice steady. Sir, my grandfather built that cabin with his own hands when this was nothing but forest. My father left it to me, and I have maintained it and paid all legal taxes on it. I never received any notification about an HOA because I did not live there full time. I have a home in Albany and use the cabin seasonally. These people have no claim to my family's property. Patricia Winters made a scoffing sound. Judge Patterson's eyes cut to her. Madam, you will have your turn to speak. Brandon Chase presented a stack of documents showing the certified letters they claimed to have sent. Marcus countered with proof that the addresses were incorrect or incomplete, designed to avoid actual delivery. Then, Patricia Winters took the stand, and I got to see the full force of her personality. Your Honor, Pinewood Ridge is a carefully planned community with high standards. We have worked hard to create a beautiful, safe environment for families. Mr. Morrison's property is an eyesore. It is a decrepit old cabin that does not meet our community standards. There are no proper setbacks, no approved architectural plans, and the structure itself is a safety hazard. When was this structure built, Mrs. Winters? Judge Patterson asked. I believe 1962, but that does not mean it should be allowed to remain in violation of our current standards. And when did Pinewood Ridge establish its standards? We incorporated in 2022. So Mr. Morrison's cabin predates your community by 60 years, and you are claiming it violates standards that did not exist when it was built. Patricia's face reddened. The law allows us to bring all properties into compliance. The law allows you to enforce standards on properties that voluntarily join your HOA, Mrs. Winters. Did Mr. Morrison voluntarily join? He owns property within our boundaries. That was not my question. Brandon Chase interjected. Your Honor, we maintain that geographical inclusion is sufficient under the HOA incorporation statute. Judge Patterson leaned back in his chair. I am going to tell you folks something. I have lived in Essex County my entire life. I remember when the Morrison cabin was built because my father helped Jake's grandfather haul some of those logs. This was wild country back then. People built what they needed and did not ask permission from anybody. Now, I understand HOAs have their place in modern developments. People agree to certain standards when they buy into those communities. But you cannot force someone into an agreement they never made, especially when their property predates your existence by half a century. Patricia looked like she wanted to argue, but Brandon Chase put a hand on her shoulder. Judge Patterson continued, "I am ruling in favor of Mr. Morrison. The foreclosure is void. The property will be immediately returned to his control, and the HOA will remove all claims and liens within 24 hours. Furthermore, I am ordering the HOA to pay Mr. Morrison's legal fees and compensatory damages for the illegal seizure of his property." I felt relief wash over me like a wave. Marcus shook my hand, but Patricia Winters was not done. "This is ridiculous. Your Honor, you cannot just ignore the law because of some sentimental story about the old days. That property is within our boundaries, and we have every right to enforce our standards. Mrs. Winters, my ruling stands. If you wish to appeal, that is your right. But for now, Mr. Morrison's property is his own." We left the courthouse with the signed order. I drove straight to the cabin, arriving just before sunset. The locks were still changed, but now I had legal authority. I called Deputy Rodriguez, and she met me there with the court order. "Congratulations, Mr. Morrison. I am happy this worked out for you." She used bolt cutters to remove the new locks, and I was finally able to enter my own cabin again. Everything inside had been disturbed. Someone had gone through my belongings, probably Patricia or someone she sent to assess the property. My hunting rifles were still locked in their case, but papers had been rifled through, cupboards opened. It made my skin crawl. I changed the locks myself that night, installing the best deadbolts I could buy in town. Then I sat down and tried to figure out what to do next. The court had ruled in my favor, but I knew Patricia Winters. I had seen her type before. She was not going to let this go. Sure enough, 3 days later I got a call from Marcus. "Jake, the HOA filed an appeal. They are also trying to get an emergency stay on the judge's order, claiming the property poses a safety hazard to the community." "On what grounds?" "They are claiming the cabin is structurally unsound and could collapse, potentially injuring hikers or trespassers. They want it condemned." "That is complete nonsense. The cabin is solid. I know, we will fight the appeal. But in the meantime, you might want to get an engineer's report showing the structure is sound. It will help our case." I hired a structural engineer from Plattsburgh who drove up and spent 4 hours examining every inch of the cabin. His report concluded that the structure was not only sound but remarkably well built, with proper foundation, solid log construction, and a roof that had been recently replaced. He estimated the cabin could easily last another 50 years with basic maintenance. Armed with that report, Marcus filed our response to the appeal. The hearing was set for 6 weeks out, which meant 6 more weeks of uncertainty and stress. During that time, I decided to stay at the cabin as much as possible. I took leave from my job as a construction supervisor in Albany and basically moved up to the Adirondacks. If Patricia wanted to play games, she was going to have to do it with me watching. The harassment started small. I would find survey stakes driven into my property line with Pinewood Ridge tags on them. Then came the noise complaints. Patricia actually called the sheriff to report me for disturbing the peace because I was splitting firewood at 3 in the afternoon. Deputy Rodriguez came out, saw what was happening, and apologized for wasting my time. "Off the record, Mr. Morrison, Mrs. Winters has called us 17 times in the past month about various complaints. Most of them are frivolous. Just keep doing what you are doing and document everything." I took her advice. I started a log of every interaction, every strange occurrence, every piece of mail from the HOA. Marcus said it might be useful. Then things escalated. I woke up one morning to find that someone had cut down 3 large pine trees on my property, right along the road frontage. The trees were old growth, probably 80 feet tall, and now they were lying in pieces. I called the sheriff immediately. This time, Deputy Rodriguez brought another officer with her. They examined the stumps and the chainsaw cuts. "This is criminal mischief and trespassing at minimum," she said. "Possibly timber theft. Those are valuable trees. Do you have any idea who did this?" "I have a pretty good idea, but no proof." "We will investigate, file a formal complaint, and we will talk to the HOA board." The investigation went nowhere. No one at Pinewood Ridge admitted to knowing anything about the trees. Patricia claimed she had no knowledge of any tree cutting and suggested that I might have done it myself for insurance fraud. The sheriff's department could not prove who was responsible without witnesses or physical evidence. I called a timber appraiser who estimated the value of the 3 trees at about $4,000. I filed that information with the sheriff and sent a demand letter to the HOA through Marcus. The appeal hearing finally arrived. We were back in front of Judge Patterson, who looked less patient this time. "Counselor Chase, I have read your appeal. You are claiming the property is a safety hazard based on what evidence?" "Your Honor, we have affidavits from community members expressing concern about the structure." "Affidavits from people who want the property removed so their property values increase, you mean?" "Mr. Thompson has submitted an engineer's report from a licensed professional stating the cabin is structurally sound. Do you have any actual engineering evidence to contradict that?" "We believe an independent assessment should be conducted." "Then you should have gotten one before filing this appeal. Your motion for emergency stay is denied." "My original ruling stands." Patricia Winters stood up without being called. "Your Honor, this is a miscarriage of justice. That property does not belong in our community." "Mrs. Winters, sit down. The property does not belong to your community. It belongs to Mr. Morrison, and it existed long before your community. This hearing is concluded." As we filed out of the courtroom, Patricia cornered me in the hallway. Her face was red, her voice shaking with anger. "You think you have won, but you have not. We will make your life so miserable that you will wish you had just sold to us when you had the chance." "Is that a threat, Mrs. Winters?" "It is a promise." Marcus stepped between us. "Mrs. Winters, you might want to be careful about threatening my client in a courthouse hallway." She stormed off, her heels clicking on the marble floor. Brandon Chase gave us an apologetic shrug and followed her. "That woman is unhinged," I said. "Document that threat. Date, time, witnesses." "Everything goes in the file." I went back to the cabin, hoping things would finally settle down. Instead, they got worse. Someone filed a complaint with the county health department claiming I had an illegal septic system. An inspector came out, checked the system my father had installed 15 years ago with all proper permits, and found it in perfect working order. Then came the complaint to the DEC claiming I was illegally harvesting timber. A forest ranger showed up and asked to see my property boundaries. I showed him the deed and the survey. He looked around, saw no evidence of commercial logging, and left. "Someone really does not like you," he said as he was leaving. "Yeah, the HOA president." "Well, you are not doing anything wrong, just keep your paperwork handy." The complaints kept coming. Fire code violations, wildlife feeding allegations, water contamination claims. Every single one was investigated and found to be baseless. But they were wearing me down. I was spending more time defending myself from false allegations than actually enjoying my property. Then, in late April, I got a call from my neighbor to the east, an elderly man named Harold Jenkins who had lived in the area for 40 years. "Jake, I thought you should know. I was at the town planning board meeting last night, and Pinewood Ridge submitted a proposal to build a new road right through your property. They are claiming it is for emergency access." They cannot build a road through my property without my permission. They are saying it is for public safety and trying to get the town to use eminent domain. I called Marcus immediately. He requested copies of the proposal and found that Patricia had put together an entire presentation claiming that emergency vehicles could not access the back section of Pinewood Ridge without a new road, and the only feasible route went directly through my property. This is harassment at this point, Marcus said. They are using every legal mechanism they can think of to force you out. Can they actually take my property through eminent domain? Not for a private HOA's convenience. Eminent domain requires legitimate public use. But we will need to fight it at the planning board level. The planning board hearing was packed. Every member of the Pinewood Ridge HOA seemed to be there, along with concerned locals who did not want to see eminent domain abused. Patricia gave her presentation with charts and maps showing the critical need for this road. When it was my turn to speak, I kept it simple. My family has owned this property for 63 years. We have never blocked anyone's access to anything. This is not about emergency services. This is about an HOA president who is angry that she could not steal my cabin through a fraudulent foreclosure. Do not let her use government power to finish the job. Harold spoke up from the audience. I have lived here for 40 years, and I have never seen an emergency vehicle have trouble accessing any part of Pinewood Ridge. This is nonsense. Other locals echoed his sentiment. The planning board deliberated for 20 minutes and voted unanimously to deny the road proposal. Patricia was furious. As people filed out of the meeting, I heard her telling her HOA members that they needed to take more direct action to deal with the problem. I reported that conversation to Deputy Rodriguez, but without a specific threat. There was nothing she could do except note it in her records. May came, and I tried to enjoy some normalcy. I did some fishing, repaired some boards on the cabin's porch, and split enough firewood to last through next winter. But I was always looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next attack. It came on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in town buying supplies when I got a call from Harold. "Jake, there are trucks at your cabin. Big equipment. Looks like they are clearing land." I broke every speed limit getting back there. What I found made my vision go red. There were 2 bulldozers on my property, pushing over trees and scraping away topsoil. A crew of workers was operating under the direction of a foreman who was checking a map that showed my land labeled as Pinewood Ridge Common Area Expansion. I jumped out of my truck and ran toward the nearest bulldozer, waving my arms. The operator saw me and shut down the engine. "What the hell are you doing on my property?" The foreman walked over, looking confused. "Sir, we have a work order from Pinewood Ridge HOA to clear this land for a new park." "This is not HOA land. This is my private property. You are trespassing and destroying my land." "Sir, we have permits and authorization." He showed me a work order signed by Patricia Winters authorizing land clearing on what the document described as Parcel 42B, Pinewood Ridge Common Area. "That is not what this is. This is my property. Here is my deed." I had started carrying a copy with me everywhere. The foreman examined it, then looked at his work order, then at the bulldozers that had already knocked down a dozen trees. "Oh man, I think we have a problem." "Yeah, you do. Shut down all equipment right now and get off my land." He made the call. The engines went silent. The crew stood around looking uncomfortable while I called both the sheriff and Marcus. Deputy Rodriguez arrived first. She looked at the destroyed trees and the torn-up ground and shook her head. "Mr. Morrison, this is way beyond a civil dispute now. This is criminal damage to property. I am going to need statements from everyone here." The foreman explained that his company had been hired by the HOA and provided with what appeared to be legitimate permits. He had no idea there was a property dispute. Marcus arrived and examined the work order and permits. These permits are fraudulent. The property description does not match the deed, and the authorization is based on false representations to the town. "Can we press charges?" I asked Deputy Rodriguez. "Absolutely. This looks like fraud, criminal mischief, and possibly forgery. I will need to bring the investigator in on this." Over the next week, the Essex County Sheriff's Department conducted a full investigation. They discovered that Patricia had submitted permit applications to the town, using altered property descriptions that made it appear the cleared land was part of the HOA's holdings. She had even created fake survey documents. The investigator, a detective named Sarah Chen, interviewed Patricia twice. According to Marcus, who had sources in the department, Patricia maintained that it was all a clerical error and that she genuinely believed the land belonged to the HOA. "That is not going to fly," Marcus said. "She has been told repeatedly by the court that this is your property." There is no way this was an accident. Detective Chen seemed to agree. On June 3rd, Patricia Winters was arrested and charged with forgery, fraud, criminal mischief, and criminal trespassing. The bail was set at $50,000. The story made the local news. HOA president arrested for property destruction. Read the headline in the Adirondack Daily Enterprise. Suddenly, people were coming forward with their own stories about Patricia's behavior. Other homeowners in Pinewood Ridge talked about her aggressive enforcement of petty rules, threats, and harassment. The HOA board held an emergency meeting and voted to remove Patricia as president. Brandon Chase quietly withdrew as their legal counsel. The new board president, a reasonable-sounding man named David Fletcher, called me directly. "Mr. Morrison, I want to apologize on behalf of Pinewood Ridge. What happened to you was completely unacceptable. The board is voting tomorrow to formally release any and all claims to your property and to compensate you for the damages." "I appreciate that, Mr. Fletcher, but the damage is already done. I've got torn up land and destroyed trees. We understand. We are prepared to offer full restoration of the damaged area and financial compensation. Would you be willing to meet with me and our new attorney to discuss a settlement?" I talked to Marcus first. He advised me to hear them out but not agree to anything without his review. The meeting happened the following week at Marcus's office. David Fletcher was there with the new HOA attorney, a woman named Jennifer Hughes, who seemed far more competent than Brandon Chase. They presented an offer of $75,000, which would cover restoration, timber loss, legal fees, and damages. "We also want to formalize in writing that your property is not and never has been part of Pinewood Ridge HOA," Jennifer said. "We will file the appropriate documents with the county to correct the boundary errors." Marcus and I stepped out to discuss it. "It is a fair offer, Jake. More than fair, actually. You could probably get more if we took it to trial, but that would take years. I just want this to be over. I want my cabin back without people constantly harassing me." Then I would recommend accepting, with one addition. I want a permanent injunction preventing the HOA from ever filing claims against your property in the future. They agreed to the addition. We signed the settlement agreement, and I walked out with a check and the promise that my property would be restored to its original condition. The restoration took most of the summer. The HOA hired a professional land restoration company that removed the bulldozer damage, regraded the soil, and planted new trees. It would not be the same as the old growth they destroyed, but at least the land was healing. Patricia's criminal case moved through the system. She pleaded not guilty and tried to claim she was just doing her duty as HOA president. The prosecutor was not buying it. In August, faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of a trial, she accepted a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to criminal mischief and fraud, receiving 2 years probation, 500 hours of community service, and restitution payments to me and the county. She also had to resign from the HOA board permanently and was banned from serving on any HOA board in New York State. I followed the case from a distance. Mostly, I focused on getting my life back. The cabin was mine again, truly mine, with no clouds on the title. The HOA had filed all the corrective paperwork with the county. I even got a formal letter from the county clerk confirming that my property had never legally been part of any HOA and that the previous boundary records had been corrected. By September, when hunting season opened, things were finally peaceful. I brought my son, Jeffrey, up to the cabin for opening weekend. He was 22 and had grown up hunting these woods with me. "Dad, I heard about everything that happened. Are you okay?" "I am now, son. It was a hell of a fight, but we won. Grandpa would have been proud." He always said to never let anyone take what is rightfully yours. We spent the weekend hunting, talking, and enjoying the woods. I got a nice 8-point buck, and Jeffrey got his first deer on this property. We hung the meat in the shed my grandfather had built and cooked venison steaks over the wood stove. That night, sitting on the porch and watching the stars, I felt something I had not felt in months. Peace. The cabin was still standing, just like it had for 63 years. The logs my grandfather cut were solid and strong. The land was healing from Patricia's destruction, and I had proven that you could fight back against people who tried to abuse the system for their own gain. I learned some things through this whole ordeal. I learned that HOAs, when run by the wrong people, could be incredibly destructive. I learned that standing up for your rights was exhausting and expensive, but necessary. And I learned that there were still good people in the system, judges like Patterson and deputies like Rodriguez, who believed in fairness and justice. The settlement money helped. I used part of it to make some improvements to the cabin. Nothing fancy, just a new well pump and some updated wiring. I put the rest into a fund for future legal expenses, hoping I would never need it, but knowing it was smart to be prepared. Word spread through the county about what had happened. I got calls from other property owners who were dealing with HOA overreach, asking for advice. I always told them the same thing: document everything, get a good lawyer, and do not back down if you are in the right. Some folks suggested I write a book about the experience or go to the media with a bigger story. But that was not my style. I just wanted to hunt, fish, and enjoy the land my grandfather had left me. Patricia, from what I heard through the grapevine, moved away from Pinewood Ridge. Apparently, once her legal troubles became public, the other HOA members made it clear she was not welcome. Her house sold in October, and she relocated somewhere downstate. I did not waste any energy thinking about her. She had made her choices and faced the consequences. The new HOA board at Pinewood Ridge actually turned out to be reasonable. David Fletcher ran things with a light touch, focusing on actual community needs rather than petty enforcement. I would see some of the residents around town occasionally, and they were always friendly. Most of them had been appalled by what Patricia did and were glad to see her gone. In November, exactly a year after I first found that foreclosure notice on my door, I held a small gathering at the cabin. Harold came, along with Marcus and his wife, Deputy Rodriguez and her husband, and a few other friends who had supported me through the fight. We had a big venison dinner, plenty of beer and stories around the fire. To property rights, Marcus said, raising his glass. To standing your ground, Harold added. To family legacy, I said, thinking of my grandfather and father and the son who would someday inherit this place. We drank and laughed and celebrated. The cabin was warm, the stars were bright, and the forest was quiet except for the occasional call of an owl. Later, after everyone had left and I was banking the fire for the night, I thought about the journey. It had started with shock and anger, finding that notice on my door. It had taken me through courtrooms and confrontations, through stress and sleepless nights, through watching bulldozers destroy my land. But I had won, not just in court but in principle. I had proven that one person standing up for what was right could beat a system designed to intimidate and overwhelm. The cabin had been built by my grandfather's hands in 1962. It had sheltered my father through countless hunting seasons. It had been the place where I taught my son to fish and hunt and appreciate the wilderness. And now, thanks to fighting back against Patricia Winters and her HOA land grab, it would continue to stand for generations to come. I locked the door and checked the perimeter one last time before bed. Everything was quiet. My truck was parked where my grandfather used to park his old Ford. The wood stove was radiating heat. The stars were doing their slow wheel across the night sky. This was what Patricia had tried to take from me, not just property but heritage. Not just a building, but 63 years of family memory. She had failed because she had underestimated how far a man would go to protect what his family had built. I slept well that night, better than I had in a year. And when I woke up the next morning to fresh snow covering the ground, I made coffee on the wood stove and sat on the porch watching the sun rise through the pine trees. Some of those trees were the ones the restoration company had planted, small and young compared to the giants that had been destroyed. But they would grow. In 50 years, they would be tall and strong, and maybe my grandchildren would hunt in their shade. The logging equipment Patricia's crew had brought to my property sat unused now, sold off by the company she had hired. But if I had needed to, I had been prepared to use my own equipment to defend this place. I owned a small logging business on the side, running a few pieces of machinery for timber work. I had been ready to physically block any further attempts to destroy my land. Thankfully, it had not come to that. The law had worked, slowly and imperfectly, but it had worked. I spent that winter at the cabin more than usual, making up for the time I had lost to legal battles. I hunted, I fished through the ice, I cut firewood, and I just existed in the place my grandfather had carved out of the wilderness. Spring came again, and with it, closure. The final restitution payment from Patricia arrived, the last legal connection to the whole mess. I deposited the check and considered the matter finished. The Adirondacks were beautiful that spring. The ice melted off the streams, the bears came out of hibernation, and new growth appeared on the trees the restoration company had planted. Life continued, as it always did in the mountains. I got a letter in May from David Fletcher. The Pinewood Ridge HOA wanted to organize a community cleanup day and were asking local property owners if they wanted to participate. It was voluntary, no pressure, just neighbors helping neighbors pick up winter debris and spruce up the area. I thought about it and decided to join. Not because I was part of their HOA, I never would be, but because being a good neighbor was important. I showed up on the designated Saturday with work gloves and trash bags. David greeted me warmly. "Jake, glad you could make it. I know things got ugly last year, but we are trying to build a better community here." "I appreciate that, David. I've got no problem with Pinewood Ridge as long as everyone understands my property is my own." "Absolutely. That is crystal clear now in writing and on all the maps. We worked together that day, clearing trails and picking up litter. Some of the HOA members were curious about my cabin and its history. I found myself telling stories about my grandfather and the early days when this was all wilderness. "That must be amazing, having that kind of family connection to the land," one young mother said. "We just moved here last year, and sometimes it feels like we are just playing house in the woods." "You will build your own history," I told her. "That is what my grandfather did." He was not from here originally either. He just decided this was where he wanted to be. The cleanup day was a success, and I drove home feeling like maybe, just maybe, things had actually worked out for the best. The bad actor was gone. The reasonable people were running things. And my cabin was safe. That summer, I brought Jeffrey up again, along with his girlfriend. They hiked the property, swam in the creek, and talked about their future. Watching them, I thought about the continuity of family and place. This cabin would outlast me, just as it had outlasted my father and would probably outlast my son. That was the whole point of building something solid, something real. In late July, I got a call from Marcus. "Jake, thought you would want to know. Patricia Winters just filed for bankruptcy. Looks like the legal fees and restitution payments wiped her out financially." "I did not want to destroy her, Marcus. I just wanted her to leave me alone." "I know. But she made her choices. She could have backed off after the first court ruling. Instead, she escalated and broke the law. Actions have consequences." He was right, of course. I felt a little sorry for her despite everything, but not sorry enough to regret fighting back. She had tried to steal my family's legacy, and she had paid the price for it. August brought the kind of perfect Adirondack, whether that reminded me why my grandfather had chosen this place. Warm days, cool nights, clear skies. I spent 2 weeks at the cabin doing nothing but fishing and reading and thinking. One afternoon, I hiked out to the far corner of my property where the old survey markers stood. These were the original markers my grandfather had set with the surveyor in 1962. Iron rods driven deep into the ground. They had withstood more than 60 years of weather and growth. Standing there, looking at my land stretching out in all directions, I felt the weight of what I had protected. This was not just about me. It was about every property owner who faced down aggressive HOAs, every family that had built something they wanted to preserve. Every person who believed that your word and your deed meant something. Patricia had learned that you could not just take what you wanted because you thought you deserved it more. The courts had reinforced that property rights mattered. And the community had shown that they would not tolerate corruption and fraud, even from their own leadership. September arrived, and with it, another hunting season. This time, I invited Harold to join Jeffrey and me. The old man was thrilled. He had hunted these woods for decades and had stories that matched my grandfather's. We sat around the cabin at night, 3 generations of Adirondack hunters, sharing venison stew and memories. Harold told stories about the early days, when there were more deer than people and you could walk for miles without seeing another soul. Jeffrey talked about wanting to bring his own kids here someday, continuing the tradition. "Your grandfather would be proud, Jake," Harold said. "Not just of the cabin, but of how you fought for it. A lot of men would have given up, taken the settlement money, and walked away. That was never an option. This place is part of who we are." The hunting was good that year. We all filled our tags and spent happy hours processing the meat and preparing it for the freezer. There was something deeply satisfying about providing food from your own land, meat you had hunted yourself in woods your grandfather had walked. As fall turned to winter, I found myself reflecting on the entire experience. It had been almost 2 years since that first foreclosure notice, and the transformation had been remarkable. I had gone from shock and anger to fighting back, from courtroom battles to criminal investigations, from watching my land being destroyed to seeing it restored. The cabin stood strong, its logs still solid, its foundation still true. My grandfather had built well, and that craftsmanship had endured not just weather and time, but legal assault and physical destruction. I kept the original foreclosure notice, framed now and hanging in the cabin. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder. A reminder that vigilance was necessary, that rights had to be defended, that standing up to bullies mattered. In December, I got a Christmas card from David Fletcher and the Pinewood Ridge HOA board. It was a nice gesture, acknowledging the holidays and wishing me well. I sent one back, keeping the relationship cordial and neighborly. Patricia was gone from my life entirely. I heard she had moved to Florida, starting over somewhere far from the scene of her legal troubles. I wished her no ill will. She had been punished enough by the legal system and her own choices. What mattered now was moving forward. I had my cabin, my land, and my peace of mind. The legal documents were all in order, the property boundaries were correctly recorded, and there was no cloud on my title. I spent Christmas at the cabin that year, just me and the quiet woods. It snowed heavily on Christmas Eve, covering everything in a blanket of white. I sat by the wood stove reading a book my father had loved, listening to the wind in the pines. This was what I had fought for. Not the building itself, though the cabin was important. Not even the land, though those 12 acres were precious. What I had fought for was the right to live how I chose, on property my family had rightfully owned for more than 60 years, without interference from people who thought they knew better. The new year came, bringing 2027 and new possibilities. I made plans for spring projects at the cabin. A new dock on the creek, some trail maintenance, maybe building a small shed for additional storage. These were the kinds of plans my grandfather would have made, practical improvements that would last. Jeffrey called in January to tell me his girlfriend had accepted his proposal. They were engaged and planning a fall wedding. He asked if they could have the ceremony at the cabin. "Dad, it just feels right. This place is so important to our family. Grandpa built it, you protected it, and I want to start my marriage here." "Son, I cannot think of anything that would make me happier." We started planning the wedding, keeping it small and intimate. Just close family and friends, a simple ceremony on the lawn in front of the cabin, with the Adirondack wilderness as the backdrop. The more I thought about it, the more perfect it seemed. This place that had been fought over, nearly stolen and ultimately preserved, would now be the site of a new beginning. The next generation would make their own memories here, adding to the legacy my grandfather had started. Spring came slowly to the mountains, as it always did. The ice broke up on the creek in March, the first flowers appeared in April, and by May, the land was green and alive again. The trees the restoration company had planted were putting out new growth, thriving in the Adirondack soil. I worked on the wedding preparations throughout the summer, building benches for guests, clearing and leveling the ceremony area, stringing lights between the trees. It was labor of love, preparing this place to welcome the next chapter of our family story. The wedding happened on a perfect September afternoon, with golden light filtering through the pine trees and a gentle breeze off the mountains. Jeffrey and his bride, a wonderful woman named Pamela Reynolds, exchanged vows in front of 50 people who had gathered to celebrate with them. Standing there watching my son get married on land my grandfather had claimed from the wilderness, on property I had fought to keep, I felt the full weight of what family legacy meant. This was why it mattered. This was why I had spent thousands of dollars in legal fees and countless hours in court. This was why I had refused to give up even when Patricia and her HOA had seemed unstoppable. After the ceremony, we had a reception in the cabin and on the lawn. People danced to music from a portable speaker, ate food prepared on the same wood stove my grandfather had installed, and celebrated under stars that had watched over this land for millions of years. Harold came up to me during the reception, a beer in his hand and a smile on his weathered face. "Jake, this is beautiful. Your grandfather would be so happy to see this. I keep thinking about him today, about how he must have stood right here in 1962, looking at the forest and imagining what it could be. He saw this cabin, this family, all of it. He saw it and he built it and you protected it. That is what men do. We build things that last and we defend them when they are threatened." The party went late into the night. Eventually, people drifted away, heading to hotels in town or camping spots nearby. Jeffrey and Pamela stayed in the cabin for their first night as husband and wife, while I camped outside under the stars, happy to give them that space. Lying in my sleeping bag, looking up at the Milky Way stretched across the sky, I thought about the journey. 2 years ago, I had been standing in the snow looking at a foreclosure notice, angry and confused. Now I was watching my son start his marriage in the place my grandfather had built, secure in the knowledge that this land would stay in our family for generations to come. The HOA had tried to take it. Patricia had used every dirty trick she could think of, from fraudulent foreclosure to illegal land clearing. She had harassed me, filed false complaints, and ultimately committed crimes trying to steal my property. But she had failed. The cabin still stood. The land was still mine. And now it would pass to Jeffrey, who would protect it just as I had, just as my father had, just as my grandfather had intended. That was the real victory, not the court rulings or the settlement money or even Patricia's criminal conviction. The real victory was knowing that this place would continue, that family legacy mattered, that standing up for what was right made a difference. I fell asleep that night listening to the wind in the pines, the same wind my grandfather had heard when he first came to this place. The same wind my father had loved. The same wind my son would teach his children to listen to. The cabin was safe. The land was protected. The legacy continued, and in the end, that was all that mattered.